The floozy and the jacuzzi, the tart with the cart, the hags with the bags. Dubliners are very fond of adding a nickname to the monuments that pop up around the city. And so it was fitting that with the arrival of a new distillery with a very unusual roof, that it would earn itself a moniker of its own. In this episode, we're going back to the golden triangle of whiskey making in Ireland's capital city to talk about the Liberties Lantern. Welcome to episode number 20 of Stories and Sips. My name is Barry Chandler, an Irishman in Ohio, introducing Americans to the tales and tastes of Irish whiskey through videos like this and in-person Irish whiskey tasting and storytelling experiences. And it's my hope that more Americans over time will abandon their bourbon and their rye, and they'll start drinking our lovely brown water and eventually book a trip to Ireland. So late last year, I spent a week in Ireland on a whiskey-inspired and indeed a whiskey-fueled trip around the country. And on my second day in Dublin, I met with my friend Mark, who suggested that we tour a new distillery in the Liberties area of Dublin, where he's from. Now, I'll be the first to admit I didn't know much about the distillery before I met him, but I soon realised that I was about to experience something very special. The Pearse Lyons Distillery is located just across the street from the famous Guinness Brewery on James Street in Dublin. In what was once the epicenter of world whiskey production, you had John Jameson, William Jameson, George Rowe and Powers all distilling here. But what's so interesting to me, and something the team at the distillery are quick to explain, is that whiskey is only part of the story here. Now, I don't think that any great whiskey has come to be without a great story. That might be the story of its origin, maybe its process, its founder, maybe its location, maybe all of the above. And if a great whiskey does come from a great story, then what's going to come out of Pearse Lyons Distillery over the coming years is going to be very special indeed. Now here on this site, I think you actually have three different elements coming together to deliver a very special story. You've got the building and the site itself, you've got the distillery and its whiskies inside, and you have the incredible story of the namesake Pearse Lyons himself. So let's explore all three elements. After a fantastic presentation in the main office building, the first stop on the tour is the graveyard. And the graveyard lies just behind the Church of St. James, the Church of St. James building right here on the site. And boy, if the ground could talk, it would have some stories to tell. Some estimates put 100,000 people buried here between the 12th and the 20th centuries, an incredible number. Now, after years of neglect, efforts are underway to restore what can be restored on this very, very historic site. We've got a lot of characters buried here in this graveyard, many famous and infamous Dublin characters who made their final journey to this destination, including James Power, the founder of Powers Whiskey himself, Sláinte. You've got the former managing director of Guinness, and the founder of Pearse Lyons' own grandfather is buried here. And in fact, 8 other Lyons family members are now known to have been buried here in this graveyard remarkably as well. Now, Pearse and his wife Deirdre acquired this building, the site, the church and the grounds in 2013, and they've painstakingly restored it. The first church was established on these grounds all the way back in 1190, and this most recent of iterations of the church dates back to around the late 1850s. Now, when the building was acquired, it was in a bit of a state of disrepair. It hadn't seen a mass in probably about 50 years, and its previous tenant was an electrical shop. The spire was even missing off the top of the church. It was taken down in 1948 for fear that it might actually fall down. And so in 2013 began the work of reimagining, of reinventing and restoring. And central to that process was the replacement of the spire. And multiple proposals and plans for that spire were rejected by local Dublin city planners until they finally agreed to this extraordinary glass spire, really a tribute to the church's history and also its reimagined future. And it's a spire that quickly became known as the Liberties Lantern, with its cool blue hue softly coating the neighbourhood at night. And then onto the inside of the church itself, inside the building. I mean, the renovations are just spectacular. You have the stained glass windows, the archways, the transepts and the nave. It is unmistakably a church, yet it has this renewed sense of purpose and a worship now of the whiskey variety happens today instead. And on the day Mark and I visited, we were the only guests at the time. We had the place to ourselves. All you could hear inside was the quiet humming of the stills and the fermenters. You're really shut away from the busy city streets outside. And I think you'll really feel like you're at a place of pilgrimage here, where the altar has been replaced by a couple of stills, but it's truly a miraculous place when you think about it, where water is no longer turned into wine, but instead into lovely brown water, whiskey itself. And this little distillery within the church walls is really the second part of the story. You've got these two beautiful stills that were brought in from Kentucky, and they are the centerpieces of this heavenly micro distillery. And they came to Ireland a few years before the distillery opened in 2017. And before the doors opened, these stills were set up in County Carlow, and they started producing their liquid there so that by the time the doors opened, there'd already be a finished product. In 2018, Pearse Lyons released their first 5-year age statement whiskey, and that was the first one from a new distillery in Ireland in more than 25 years. And each of the range of their whiskies, of the Pearse Lyons range of whiskies, is available to taste on the tour, and it's a fantastic experience sitting inside this incredible building, sitting at a bar counter in this old church and sampling all of these whiskies. It really is a unique experience. Now, they've used a proprietary strain of yeast in the double distillation process, and the new make liquid is then aged in ex-bourbon barrels that come from their own sister distillery in Kentucky. So what's Kentucky got to do with all of this, and what's the Kentucky connection? Well, for that, we have to turn to the third part of the story, to the namesake of the distillery, Mr. Pearse Lyons himself. Now, Pearse sadly passed away in 2018, but his legacy is in fact a global one. Now, for me as an Irishman in America, I marvel at what he and his family accomplished. Indeed, I've heard the name Pearse Lyons many times here in Ohio, and I hadn't realized just the extent of his impact. But it's hard to imagine that Pearse could have squeezed more into his life. And in fact, this video could easily have been a few hours long. Such is the list of achievements and accomplishments. But consider just some of these highlights. Pearse worked for Guinness and Harp. He was an engineer who helped design and build the new Midleton Distillery, which we've spoken about often. He emigrated with his young family from Ireland to America in the late 1970s. From his garage in his house in Kentucky, he started an animal feed company, Alltech, which he grew into a $3 billion business with 3,000 employees around the world and a presence in about 128 countries. He created the Alltech Lexington Brewing and Distilling Company. He was an enormous benefactor of the arts in Kentucky and Ireland. He founded a number of business incubators to support the next generation of scientists. He funded science labs in schools in the United States and also in Ireland. And he reconnected with his Irish roots with the founding of the Pearse Lyons Distillery in Ireland. I mean, these are just the highlights. I read just reams and reams of impacts and achievements and accomplishments that Pearse and his family had over the past 40, 50 years have accomplished. And it really is incredible. I mean, today his family should be immensely proud of his achievement and his unwavering focus on making life a little bit better for those around him. And this, you see, for me, the story of whiskey is not just the scientific process that creates it. It's about so much more. And I've talked about this at length in my videos. And indeed, in last week's episode, I shared how Waterford Distillery are betting the house on terroir, which is the environmental factors that give their whiskey its flavour. Their story is the story of the farmers, the fields, the climate, the proximity to the ocean. Many elements to make a great whiskey and a great story. And I think it's exactly the same here in Pearse Lyons Distillery. There are many great elements needed to come into this great story. I mean, you've got the historical site and those who've walked its courtyard and its aisles and those who are laid to rest in the shadow of its steeple. You've got the story of the micro distillery and the process inside the building, the whiskies, and then you've got the story of the man behind it all. The greatest whiskies are complex, in my opinion. They take time to understand, to fully appreciate. There's far more to the Pearse Lyons Distillery story than an episode of Stories and Sips can do justice to. So to truly appreciate it and its whiskies, you're just going to have to go visit yourself. You'll find all the details you need to do that in the notes of this episode. So to Pearse and his wife Deirdre, their children, to Conor Ryan and the team at the distillery, you've brought all the elements of the story together beautifully. And I hope there'll be many years of whiskey worship at your altar. And thank you, Mark, for a great old day out that we had. 47 whiskies, I think we sampled, if I remember correctly. To all of you, sláinte.